as the wheels continue to fall off for the Ukrainian military, as Russia continues to make more and more progress on both the Eastern Front and up in the north with the Kursk operation. There is news coming out that apparently Russia is getting help from the North Koreans. We know they've been getting lots of artillery shells and rockets and potentially missiles and other military support. But now then we have credible reports for the first time that North Korean troops have been seen at least in the theater. Now, what they're doing there remains still uncertain, as we're going to get into here later. But we're going to have Colonel Doug Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, highly decorated combat veteran and great American leader with us today to help unpack all this. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Good to see you.
Well, let's get into this. First of all, even before we play some of the sound bites that we have from Secretary of Defense, who's talking about this topic here, what do you make of the reports that there are North Koreans in the theater?
Well, this material came from a news service in South Korea that is aligned with the current president of Korea, who is a very obedient servant of the American greater empire. And they frequently publish narratives and things that are straight from the CIA. This is a good example of disinformation. The photograph that was shown on the front with a flag on the hill was taken in Manchuria. In other words, if you look at Manchuria on the map, most of it is in China, but some of it is also in Russia. And remember, North Korea and Russia share a border. And as a result, there are routine training exercises and educational operations conducted inside Russia for the North Korean military, and this is one of them. You're seeing North Korean troops that are being trained by Russian officers. The other point is that whenever North Korean or any other foreign contingent comes to Russia while they are in Russia, this includes people attending general staff colleges, military academies, they all wear Russian uniforms. That's standard practice. So what they did is they took something that's happening routinely and is no different from things that we do for other countries with whom we are friendly or allied, except that they didn't bother to point out this is nowheres near Ukraine and this has nothing to do with Ukraine, except there is a possibility. And obviously I could not translate the Russian into English. I haven't had a chance to get somebody to do that, but we think probably these troops were being given insights into Russian tactics that have worked so well in Ukraine. But beyond that, this has nothing to do with the Russian operation in Ukraine, and I don't expect to see any Korean troops show up there anytime soon.
And that's that actually mirrors. I actually had a lunch yesterday with a member of the South Korean diplomatic corps here in Washington, who said the best that they could see was that there was around 1,500, not 11,000, in the far east of Russia, and they were going through some sort of training. So that matches what you're saying as well. But when you look at it from the public side, Gary, let's go ahead and play both of those for a specific reason. Last night on Fox News, Austin was talking about the possibility of this, and he's given a little bit of interpretation as to what it might mean.
Ukraine's military intelligence chief says nearly 11,000 North Korean troops are in Russia now and will be ready to fight in Ukraine by November 1st. Have you seen evidence of this?
If it is true, it speaks to the point that Putin must be weakened to a greater extent than most people think. We know that Putin's losing a lot of people.
Yeah, and I wanted to touch that based on that. That aspect, this idea that, that just shows you, because I've heard this from others, that's how weak Russia is, that they are in such desperate need that they're bringing in Ukrainian or Russian, North Korean troops to Russia. What do you say to that?
Well, that's nonsense, and I think probably Lloyd Austin knows that, and so he gave it the best spin that he could think of, which is to try and reinforce the false narrative that somehow or another Russia has been harmed by what's happening in Ukraine. And as you and I have talked for many, many times, we know just how powerful Russia has become thanks to this war. The only thing we've done is help the Russians to build up arguably the largest and most effective army in the world. So the notion that they've been hurt or they need extra troops, and we know from reports inside Russia There are lots of people volunteering to fight. They want to fight. That's not a problem for the Russians. I think there's something else that your viewers should know, though. This Jennifer Griffin, who interviewed Lloyd Austin, is not only a card-carrying neocon who actively supports whatever war the neocons are ginning up at the time, is also a very strong Zionist. So she's pushing war in the Middle East against everyone and pushing war in Ukraine against Russia. You would expect her to pick up false information like this without question, reprint it, republish it, disseminate it. And I think Austin gave a pretty good answer until he started to try and argue that Russia has severely weakened, which it isn't. You know, the latest figures say that the Ukrainians have lost 1.2 to 1.5 million in terms of casualties, and that's about 600,000 plus dead. The Russians have sustained a fraction of that number, perhaps a little over 100,000 casualties, if that. So the whole thing is preposterous. But what do you expect when you have nothing else to support your argument? You lie.
Yeah, that is the modus operandi across the board in Washington, and I'm afraid we're probably going to see more examples of that as we go on here. I want to shift on more to that conversation that I just showed a bit of with Jennifer Griffin, because there's a number of things that both she posits and that he also echoes and expands upon, which I think are important to discuss across the board here, not merely just in the Russia-Ukraine war, but just categorically as well. And one of the first ones here is that they're going to basically, what I call, this is kind of a Make-A-Wish Foundation dream and fantasy about strategy and how that Russia is actually a lot weaker than they say, and it gives an opportunity. Watch this.
There are some Americans questioning whether the U.S. can afford to keep supporting Ukraine. Why does Ukraine still matter? And what is at stake if the U.S. stops funding Ukraine?
There's a lot at stake, Jen. You know, we don't want to live in a world where a tyrant can wake up and decide to erase his sovereign neighbor's border. If Putin is successful, he will continue to do what he's done. All of the Baltic states are very concerned about. They rightfully feel that they would be next on the menu.
Next on the menu. I mean, he talks about there like, we don't want to wake up in a world where fill in the blank. Okay, fair enough. That's something you could aspire to, but then you have to match that with actually reality on the ground. And when he talks about, Doug, this issue that the Baltics are going to be next on the menu, that Russia just has this methodical thing, they're going to start chewing everybody up, that stands in complete contradiction to what the Russians have actually said and what they have done. Watch this from Vladimir Putin just this past June about what he said actually is his objective.
The essence of our proposal is not some kind of temporary truce or suspension of fire, as, for example, the West wants. This is not about freezing the conflict, but about its final completion. And I will say again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events proposed today, agrees to the complete withdrawal of its troops from the DPR and LPR in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and really begins this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without delaying them. I repeat, this is our principled position. Neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification.
Now, obviously, anybody can say anything they want to, and there's plenty of people that would say, oh, that's just what Putin's saying. But really, he does want to gobble up the rest of the Baltics. What do you say to both Austin's claim and then what Putin has laid out?
Well, just remember that you have Jennifer Griffin, who already knows the answers to the questions because they align with the neocon narrative. And from the very beginning, the narrative says, unprovoked, the Russians marched into Ukraine, and the innocent Ukrainians are simply valiantly defending their country. So, from start to finish, it's all nonsense. We goaded the Russians, the Ukrainians goaded the Russians, Ukrainians were already killing Russians, as well as subjugating them. So that's all nonsense, and we know that. And when the Russians went in, the first thing people started to say was, oh, well, the Russian army's incompetent, it's incapable, it's too small. Well, if it's incompetent and incapable and too small, how does it threaten the rest of Europe? But nevertheless, that's been transformed. Oh, no, Russia wants to conquer Eastern Europe and restore the Warsaw Pact or some nonsense like that. This is not new. Lloyd Austin gave the answers that he's been trained to give. Now, in defense of Lloyd Austin, and I'm by no means a fan, But in defense of Lloyd Austin, he is, as far as I can tell, one of the few voices inside the administration who has repeatedly said privately, don't push this any further. We are not prepared for a major war. We're certainly not prepared for a war against Russia, and certainly not against one that would involve Russia, Iran, and China. So whatever he says publicly, he's saying because he thinks that's his obligation as a member of the administration to repeat the nonsense. So he's repeating it, but it's nonsense. And Jennifer Griffin is part of the crowd in New York City and Washington, D.C. that want desperately for these wars to carry forward. They see them as inextricably intertwined. Zelensky in Kiev and Netanyahu in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. That's where we are. So that's what explains the answers. It's
and we're going to continue on down that path.
In Moscow and reconquering or absorbing the Baltic states. Putin understands very clearly something that Solzhenitsyn said repeatedly, and Solzhenitsyn ultimately met with Putin on numerous occasions before he died. Solzhenitsyn always argued Russians need to be out of the business of ruling people who are not Russians. Unless, of course, those people opt to be part of Russia. And there are 20 million Muslims. Many of those Muslims initially didn't want to be in Russia. Now they do, and they're very happy. But the majority of the people in Russia are Russians. And that was the whole goal when Russia was essentially liberated from the burden of trying to manage everybody else in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. They got to focus for the first time in centuries on Russia. That's where Putin's focus is. He's a nationalist. He's worried about Russia. He doesn't want to rule anybody else who isn't Russian. But again, if we try to put missiles that can strike the Russian interior into Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia, yes, he's going to intervene to stop it. And in Finland, what were we prepared to do in Cuba? It's no different.
Yeah. And I want to look now at the continuation of that, because we're definitely related here, and it really just follows in the next logical sequence from what you would expect based on what you've already talked about here, and that is this idea, which is voiced by so many on the warmongering right. Oh, well, it's not even right; it's the uniparty, the warmongering uniparty. That anything besides, yes, let's go kill everybody and send missiles and weapons everywhere, is isolationism. Watch this exchange.
There's an increasing move towards isolationism in the U.S. Does this concern you?
Of course it does. We are a global power, and we're going to need to continue to do what's necessary to protect those interests.
So, yeah, we're going to do whatever it takes to protect those interests. So he's claiming there that anything that we're doing is to protect our interest. How do you see it?
Well, he also said something else we can't lose sight of. He said, we are a global power. This is a very important statement. Much of what we do in Washington is mortgaged to two things: vanity and self-delusion. Both vanity and self-delusion demand that we portray ourselves to the world and to our own population as this unchallenged global power. And the implication is American military hegemony is not only something that we want, it's something that everybody else favors and appreciates. Well, that's not true. And it hasn't been true for a long time. First of all, it's unaffordable. I mean, your $34 trillion debt that's piled up, national sovereign debt, didn't pile up by accident. And the solution right now in both parties, the answer is, we'll just keep printing money. But if you look at BRICS, if you look at the emergence of new institutions that are going to compete with things like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in the future, it's pretty obvious that this is not going to go on in perpetuity. We are on the threshold of a very serious financial crisis. We don't need to, keep pretending it's otherwise. You've got Nassim Taleb telling everybody Armageddon is just over the hill, and he's right. But we're going to pretend otherwise until the bitter moment arrives. And of course, that was true with Great Britain before and during the outbreak of World War II, for which they were completely unprepared and incapable of fighting. The only thing that saved them was the English Channel. And then ultimately we came in, and the rest is history. But they bankrupted themselves, destroyed themselves, and became a third-rate power. We don't want to do that, which is one of the reasons that we argue against it. That's not isolationism. That's prudence. The second thing is there's no appreciation for the extent to which the world has changed. You listen to these people, you think this is 1991. It isn't. 2024 is a new world, a fundamentally different world. And that needs to be understood. Iran has come roaring back, not because they picked up a couple of $1 billion that was theirs anyway. It's been happening for some time. The same thing is true in Turkey. Do they have problems? Do they have difficulties? Of course, but these are great powers. China was the richest power in the world for most of the last 2,500 years. But they spent about 340 of the last 500 years under foreign domination. And little Israel is entirely a dependent state, a dependency of the United States. And we've been doing this for a long time, which has absolved them of the responsibility to get along with their neighbors, to behave, frankly, like a normal state. We've underwritten their military power and capability and backed them up to the point where they've now driven us into a corner, all of us, not just the people in the Middle East, but us as well, putting us in a position where, if we don't support Israel, given the terrible things the Israelis have done in the last few months, Israel might not survive at all. The point is that this question of isolationism has nothing to do with walking away from the rest of the world. We don't need to do that. We've never done that. We don't have to do that. But we do have oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, that have protected us. And we can limit our interests. We don't have to be everywhere all the time. In fact, trying to be everywhere has bankrupted us. We can't afford 800 and plus bases all over the world. That should be cut in half or less. And it can be done, but it's not going to happen until we have financial disaster on the doorstep.
Well, yeah, and you just asked that headline there that Gary's showing there. Everyone continues to say anything besides that is isolationism. And I wanted to zero in on one of the things that Austin did say there is he said, we have to, quote, protect those interests, Americans. And so he says that's why we can't turn into isolationists because we got to protect our interests. But then you look at what we're actually doing and this completely open-ended support for Israel, which you just mentioned there, this absolute abject unwillingness to acknowledge that the war in Russia is over and is the decision's already been made. It's just now then we're just waiting to see what the final terms end up doing, but we're ignoring all that. How does that play into America's interest? Or put a different way, do you see that what we're doing actually protects American interests?
Well, the answer is obviously no. But consider the following things. First of all, the use of the term isolationism is much like the use of the term anti-Semitism. Anyone who says, I don't like what the Israeli state is doing, I think that we should not support that, is an anti-Semite. Anyone who suggests that our forces positioned all over the world are no longer protecting us, in fact, they're worse than tripwires. They're increasingly catalysts for conflict. We talked about the 23,000 troops that we have in Syria and Iraq and Jordan and the Persian Gulf, and we can't protect them. And what are they protecting? They're not protecting anything. The people in those countries want us to leave. With the potential exception of Jordan, but I rather think privately they'd like us to go too. You've got a problem everywhere there are U.S. forces right now. Inside Germany, the people most interested in keeping our forces in Germany are the store owners outside the various military bases who profit enormously from the U.S. military presence. But the Germans, of course, like the Japanese, have all been absolved of the responsibility and the obligation to protect themselves. This, of course, was Donald Trump's point in his first administration. These people are rich and wealthy and effective. Why are we subsidizing defense for them? They can do it for themselves. He was right. That's not isolationism. That's rationality. And again, it's back to this business of vanity, national narcissism. How can you admit that you're not vital to everybody everywhere all the time? And it's sort of like every admiral in the Navy wants to stand on the quarter deck of the pilot deck of the Nimitz aircraft carrier with the wind blowing through his hair, and he's leading the Nelsonian Jutland Midway fleet into battle. Well, those days are over. Nobody wants to come to terms with it. We haven't even begun to appreciate just how lethal all of the various precision-guided munitions and capabilities are as they are distributed across the country. I mean, look at the Houthis. They're not even a nation state. And with precision-guided missiles at their disposal, they've shut down traffic in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf and elsewhere. They actually put an aircraft carrier out of business for a while. Everything has changed, but we have not. So the isolationism is another canard, just like anti-Semitism. Forget it. Throw them out.
And see, I actually argue that there is a significant cost, in addition to everything you just said, that weakens our national security. And one of the rare points of this interview, Jennifer Griffin actually asked a very pertinent question, and watch the difficulty Austin has of answering it.
Senator J.D. Vance has been one of the loudest opponents of aid to Ukraine, arguing that the U.S. defense industrial base can't produce enough to keep supporting Ukraine and Israel. Does he have a point?
We've seen an increase in production in artillery shells, anti-tank weapon systems, and a number of things. Our industrial base has picked up the pace. They are expanding production.
Okay, so it's picked up the pace and it's expanding production. That's technically a true statement. It's definitely more than it was. However, the administration officials in just a month ago, one of which was Austin, actually acknowledged just how low we actually are. Watch this from Jake Sullivan from last month when he's talking about interceptor missiles.
Ukraine was running short of air defense interceptors. So I sat down with my team and I said, where are we sending Patriot missiles and AMRAAM missiles around the world in the next 12 months? And I was told there's a whole list of countries we're sending them to. And I said, take every single one of those missiles, every one, and send them to Ukraine. That was not an easy thing to do. It required us to get our allies and partners to come along. Frankly, it required our bureaucracy to come along. And we are currently working on a substantial package, pulling together a range of different capabilities that we are going to try to get out the door before the end of this month.
So you see there that he's admitting that we are so short on interceptor missiles that all of our 17, as it turns out, global partners or people who have purchased our stuff across the globe had to do without so that we could send them all to Ukraine. That was before things started ramping up in Israel, and potentially now that's going to get even more if there's a strike into Iran. And then it's going to potentially open-ended thing. So already we're in a situation where we're dangerously low on that. Austin himself also said around that same time that, listen, about long-range weapon missiles, there's not enough ATACMS or British or French missiles to sustain an attack that the Ukraine side wanted to launch into Russia. So you have Austin himself admitting we don't have enough of the key weapon system. So it seems to me that following this course of action of these so-called not interventionists, not isolationism, is costing us seriously that could undermine our own national security if we get into a fight.
Well, keep something in mind. Russia does have the legacy from the Soviet state of having been a war mobilization industrial complex. Everything Stalin did during his tenure before World War II was designed to fight World War II. He began that process in 1929, 30, and 31. It cost millions of lives, was sometimes counterproductive, but ultimately they built this scientific industrial base designed to produce tens of thousands of everything. So the Russians have an appreciation for this. And when they essentially went through the breakup period, they did preserve certain capabilities, and their culture supports this. It's not difficult to mobilize the Russian people and move them in a particular direction because they have the experience of having done that in the past. That doesn't mean they want to do it now, but it's just simply a statement of fact. Russia is a continental power. Their power is on land, not sea, and they don't need much sea power. All they need is a fleet of submarines that can sink other people's ships, and they've got that. They've got lots of missiles and rockets that can reach out to sea and destroy any number of conventional surface vessels. So Russia is in a very strong position. They're almost completely self-sufficient because of the enormous resources they have. Then look at us. We are not a continental power. We're only a continental power in the Western Hemisphere. You know, for us, it's thousands of miles that have to be traversed in order for us to reach the scene of action. Then in addition to that, we shipped out much of our industrial base in the 90s, and then again in the early part of this century, so that lots of people in Washington and corporate America and the ruling class could become billionaires and 100 millionaires and millionaires. Now we don't have much industrial capacity as it is, and what we do have resides surprisingly, with the big five defense firms. Those big five defense firms are largely state-sponsored organizations. Without the government feeding them money, they don't have much alternative. It's not like it was in 1942, where you convert Ford from building cars to building tanks, and then after the war, you go back to building cars. So we have a huge problem in that we can produce certain things, but we can't surge. That means that, yes, we've ramped up production of various things like artillery shells, and we're trying to produce more missiles, but we cannot surge. The Russians can surge. That means if Putin turns around and the Minister of Defense and the Chief of Staff say, we need 10,000 more of X, and we need it by the end of the week, they'll surge. They may not get 10,000 out, but they'll probably get 8,000 copies of whatever it is that they need, because they have the excess capacity and the labor directed from the center. We can't do that. And missiles and rockets, particularly the kinds that the Russians are using, take a lot of time to develop and produce. And I see you've got the article up there by Mackenzie Eaglin, another neocon and a big advocate for war everywhere. And she's telling the truth. We can't produce as rapidly as we need to. Does that mean we need to convert ourselves into a war mobilization state? Of course not. That's not what we want. We don't need it. But we think we do, because most of our thinking is stuck in the early 20th century. This is 2024. The rest of the world is not interested in war, contrary to what the neocons tell us. They're busy trying to do business. There's a thing called the BRICS Summit. It hasn't even been covered in this country. There are 44 nations represented there and another 40 that want to join on top of what's already in there. What's it about? Well, it's about commerce and making money and marketing goods. How does it work? Well, you've got this Chinese Belt and Road that's not built for military power. It's built to ship products all over Europe and Asia and Africa, made in China. And that is a money-making machine that's being built, not a war-making machine. And everybody now realizes that and wants to jump on board the money-making machine. We could do something very similar in our own country. I wrote an article called The Golden Spike that was published in Washington Times back in 2017 or 2018. I can't remember which. And it talked about building high-speed transport at sea, designed to bring goods from Asia and Europe to the United States, and then put them on board high-speed trains and ship them back across the continent in very high-speed Atlantic and Pacific. And unlike the Chinese solution, it has to go through multiple nations where everybody has a handout. We're one country. We speak one language. So you're decreasing the time it takes to cross the vast expanse of Central Asia. Now, we're not in the game. We're too busy worrying about waging war in eastern Ukraine, in a part of the world where we have no strategic interest and never have had such a one. Yeah, thank you, Gary. That's it. There it is. People need to look at that. I tried like all get out to get people in the Trump administration interested. They weren't interested. This is what we need right now. This should be part of Trump's platform. This would make him enormously popular, because you're talking about developing the heartland, moving all these goods through vast areas that have been ignored, setting up supply and redistribution points for all sorts of products. What do we produce that nobody else does? You name it. We've got all sorts of things. We can produce things faster, better, cheaper, but we have to have infrastructure. What have we allowed to atrophy and deteriorate? Infrastructure. That's what this is about. That's what we should be about. Not war with Russia, not war with Iran, not war with China, for God's sakes.
And you know, Doug, instead of doing things like that, that make enormous sense for the United States and our domestic economy, doesn't, potentially make enemies all over the place. Instead, we're doing things that are focused on money, but in a different direction.
Yeah. The money goes in a do loop. It goes into people's pockets. It enriches the seven richest counties in the country that surround Washington, D.C. That's the problem.
And here's what Austin had to say about it.
Some Americans think that the U.S. is just sending $100 billion in cash to Ukraine, and they worry about corruption. Which are some of the states that are benefiting, and how does this work?
Ohio, Texas, Alabama, you name it. There are a number of states that benefit directly. We do not send cash over to Ukraine. We draw down equipment and we replace those munitions with something that's probably a little bit more modern and more effective.
So you see, it's not about interest. It's not about protecting our interests. And that's why we don't want so-called isolationism. It's because we want the arms industry to make money. And then they try to say there's a reason why it's cool to keep going to Ukraine, cool to keep going to Israel, because it helps, Ohio and Texas, et cetera. But that doesn't, I think you've said this before, those kinds of operations don't produce positive economic output. It just produces weapons that go somewhere else.
Well, there's not much return on investment in military power. And that's why in peacetime, there has been a habit of maintaining only what you needed as a strategic hedge against the possibility that you may have to fight a major war. Now, this goes back to the Eisenhower years. This is before we decided to forcibly democratize the world. And that's the problem. War against China, the U.S. would exhaust all that it has. So the real question is, why do you want to go to war with China? And I've heard people say, oh, well, we have to stop them. Stop them from what? Oh, well, they're intimidating people. Well, the last time I looked at ASEAN, the Asian Southeast Asian Alliance that we helped to form back many, many years ago, nobody wants us to interfere with anybody. In fact, the president of the Philippines has come out and said, we don't want to be involved in a war with China, that you could drag us into such a thing. Again, Americans are getting a very perverse, inaccurate picture of the world that we live in. And this is not good for the United States. Does that mean that we don't need a healthy scientific industrial base that can produce weapons? No, it's not what it means. But it means that we're ignoring everything else at the expense of one thing. And that's not going to go on in perpetuity.
Exactly. And I think that's kind of the juxtaposition between the article that you referred, Darren. By the way, we're going to put that in the description if anybody wants to go and read it, because that's where there is a return on investment and it doesn't create any enemies overseas other than possibly competitors. But the bigger issue is that it comes not at the expense of helping the United States. And I totally 100% agree with you that we need a military industrial base. Absolutely. Because then we would invite, others to do things on top of us. But it's all about balance and focus. And I want to put something up here that really gets to something you said just a second ago.
Okay.
What you've kind of laid out is what we ought to do. But now then you see what China and Russia are doing.
Прошедшие 75 лет российско-китайские отношения, уровень всеобъемлющего партнерства и стратегического взаимодействия. И мы можем с полной уверенностью утверждать, что они стали образцом того, как в современном мире должны строиться отношения между государствами. Наше многоплановое сотрудничество носит равноправный, взаимовыгодный и абсолютно неконъюнктурный характер.
See, so they're saying, hey, we want to provide a new pole, not a pole. I think nodal is the way some are talking about it. So it's not just a unipolar moment, the United States, but they're just saying, hey, we want to make money. That's what the whole BRICS thing is about. And can we compete with that?
Well, I think we could, but we're not. Instead, we're threatening to punish people that opt to trade in something other than the dollar. If you don't trade in dollars, which is to our advantage so that we can pass our debt on to you, then we're going to sanction you and punish you. We're still in the bully mode. That's what we've done for decades. It's not going to work anymore. And that's why there's so much attention on the emergence of this new parallel system, because people want to get out from under us. So no. And the second thing about Russia and China is that the Chinese, contrary to popular belief, millions of them don't want to move to Siberia, which is just over the border. That's not an interest in China. No Chinese wants to go up there and live. The Chinese, however, know that there is an abundance of resources up in Russia, and they need those resources to fuel their economy. The Russians need hard cash, and they also need help from China for security reasons. And so this is a mutually beneficial arrangement. There will be no war between Russia and China. There's no need for it. That's the real message that Putin sent.
And that's also, what's I think is so attractive to the BRICS by a number of countries outside of our orbit that we would like to influence to go into our side, but we're not providing any incentive for them to do so, which perversely not only has our bullying stuff, as you called it, pushed China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran militarily kind of together. Now it's also all these other even non-military situations pushing people in their orbit as well, because there's the more opportunity for stability, which everybody needs in order to have economy. But
I think there's something else that people don't understand is in this relationship between the two, Putin listens carefully to the economic advice that he gets from Xi. He's very keen on being successful inside Russia with his own economy. Xi is very keen on the military advice that Putin gives. What do I mean by that? The Russians have a martial culture. They fought many, many wars. They know what they're doing. Chinese really haven't fought that many wars, and the ones they did fight, they lost. China doesn't want to go through what it went through with the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, or what it suffered with during the century of shame and humiliation against the Europeans. That's uppermost in their minds, but it's defensive in its orientation. And ultimately, whenever they get into a real dispute, the two sides, whether they're Filipinos or Thai or Cambodian or Malays, or it doesn't matter, Indonesians, they talk. There's no interest in an armed confrontation. We try to militarize all of these disputes because that's all we now bring to the table. What are we bringing to the table otherwise? By the way, that article called the Golden Spike Project was co-written by a good friend of mine, Steve Burke, and we were working together, and we worked together back in 2007, 2008 behind the scenes for the Secretary of the Navy. And so we were very familiar with the alternatives when it came to ship designs, particularly high-speed transport vessels with a dual potential capability. They could carry military, or they could carry commercial things. The reason I bring that up is that we are back struggling with what to do with our shipyards. How many can we keep working? How do we modernize them? It's been a problem for years. There's a way to do it, but you've got to commit to high-speed transport. We need transport that'll move across the Atlantic in 4 or 5 days, regardless of the sea state. We need similar capabilities in the Pacific. Again, this is the sort of thing that has to be built that augments and complements the rail system we're talking about. And the rail system in this country is a shadow of what it once was. We were the greatest railroad power in the world. The Germans modeled everything they did under Bismarck under what we were doing at the time. And that's how they built their tremendous rail system, which was so instrumental in their victories in so many operations. We need to go back and examine all of this. I hope we can do this, but we've got to get out of this perpetual war business, this notion that we have to be everywhere all the time. It's a disaster. It's unnecessary. And increasingly, it's just a catalyst for war.
Indeed. I couldn't put it any better myself. I want to shift in the amount of time we have left here to the other war front, and that is in the Israel, I guess you can't even say Hamas situation anymore. Now it's more like the Middle East because Israel keeps expanding the number of enemies that they're going after. I want to start off the first, though, that talking about this intelligence leak that allegedly came from one of the U.S. intelligence agencies about what's going on with this Israeli preparation for an attack into Iran. First of all, I'm just curious if what your understanding was, who might have been behind this, and why would this one document have been leaked?
Well, I know that everybody's asking that question, and I'm not really sure that I have a good answer for you. The only thing I would say is that just as was the case with the last few leaks, there are growing numbers of people in uniform inside the military and some who are civilians simply employed by the Department of Defense who do not share Jennifer Griffin's enthusiasm for wars against everyone that Jennifer Griffin and her friends dislike. And I think that's part of the problem. You've got people that have said, wait a minute, we don't want to be drawn into this terrible war in the Middle East that we don't need to fight. And I suspect that some of that goes on. Yeah, I don't think it had anything to do with anybody who's Iranian. That's the ultimate red herring here. Right, Iran tried to kill the president. Nonsense,
Yeah.
That's all crap. But I think some of that may be behind this. We don't know. And I don't think we're ever going to get the truth out of the government. I told an audience last night while I was in Parkersburg, West Virginia, great people. I said to them when I was speaking for Our Country, Our Choice, I said there's a phrase in the Old Testament, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I said, well, the fear of the government and the media is the beginning of political wisdom. And that's where we are now, because we're just not hearing the truth. We're not getting full stories. You know, we used to have newscasts where people came on, and instead of castigating the people that came on, they let the two people that were representing different points of view speak. It was not a fight. It was not a wrestling match. And it went on for a certain period of time. Thank you very much for coming on. And they went on to something else. We don't do that anymore. Well, we are being fed narratives. And the media are part of it. She's part of it. And that's the disappointing side of Fox and of all the media. They're all pitching narratives. We got to get out of the narrative business and get back to let's find out what the truth is and just report it and let people out there know what the picture really is, and they'll decide for themselves. But I think there are a lot of people that don't want anybody in this country to make any decisions.
Yeah, and I guess following that path of, what is the truth and how much can you trust what the government is saying? We had this one, Gary, if you can bring up that other full screen of Blinken there. He's talking about, here's some of the progress that's being made, and Israel is needed more more progress is being made, and Israel is needed on the Gaza aid flow. And in there, he says, Blinken said he discussed the urgent and sustained steps required for Israel to improve humanitarian conditions. But Doug, look, when you just look with your own eyes of what's going on in the Gaza Strip, and you listen to the statements that the Israeli leaders across the board keep making, I don't see any universe where you could call that progress for the help of the Gaza people.
There's no interest in helping anybody in Gaza. Let's be frank. That's non-existent in Washington. There may be a few people out there like Justin Amash, former congressman. I don't know if he's still in the House or not, but he lost some relatives. There are a few people out there that care about the Arab Christians, but not many. So I don't think there's any serious interest there at all. Bear in mind, whatever Americans want to think, that's fine. But the truth is, no one in the Middle East thinks that Blinken represents anyone's interest other than Israel's. We need to understand that. And we are widely viewed as a country that is ruled by Blinkens, people exactly like him, neocons and Zionists. So they don't expect anything to come out of any discussions they hold with that man anymore. And that also applies to this man, Amos Hochstein, who has been representing our interests in Lebanon. Again, he's viewed as simply an agent for Netanyahu. As we've said so many times, you want to know who's in charge? It's Netanyahu. And you follow the money. And that's the bottom line. He's in charge, not this administration. And I dare say the next administration coming in probably will find itself in very much the same position.
And in fact, just going down that list there about who's listening to whom and who's calling the shots. Here's Secretary Austin a few days before this talking about what he claims is Israel listening to him.
The numbers of civilian casualties have been far too high. We'd like to see, Israel scale back on some of the strikes that it's taking, especially in and around Beirut. And we'd like to see things transition to some sort of negotiation that would allow civilians on both sides of the border to return to their homes. That's the point that I'll continue to make with Minister Gallant. And I think, yes, he does take on my input.
Does he, though? Does Gallant take in his input? Does anyone in Israel take input from any American, from the president on down?
No, I dare say that they're following Mr. Netanyahu, and so is everybody else. I have no doubt that Lloyd Austin is sincere in his comments, but we have to look at what people say and what actually happens. So we can sit here and debate what I think is indisputable, that people are trying to herd Israel in a direction where it has absolutely no interest in going, and understand that right now the governments in London and in Washington are both interested in seeing the Greater Israel Project happen. They're interested in seeing Syria also fall into Israeli hands, along with at least half of or more of Lebanon, and ultimately at some point engulf Jordan. The expansionist power on the ground is supported by the former colonial power, Great Britain, and by the U.S. government. This kind of thing is quite real. We don't talk about it publicly, but there's plenty of evidence that this is going on. I don't see any evidence that that's going to change unless a military defeat is inflicted on us and our friends in Israel, to be blunt.
And would you look at, to your point there about what is being said and done on the ground? I mean, you see that the Gary showing up right there, where Israel's once fringe movements to reoccupy Gaza is gaining momentum. In fact, there was a woman named Daniela who has been featured in a number of documentaries lately. She's kind of been out on the edge, Daniela Weiss. And boy, when you see this woman actually talking, she's been out there on the right. But now then, she was invited to this Likud meeting, speaking at a Likud-backed conference, in which it had several of the high-ranking members of the parliament and even Netanyahu's government that were in there. And they are saying, and you see it right there on the screen, that the Palestinians will, quote, disappear from Gaza. And she's not kidding on that. And by the way, she really kind of came to fame and came onto Netanyahu's radar because she is leading a settler movement throughout the West Bank to get rid of Arabs from there as well. And when you see this gaining public notoriety and high profile on the Israeli media, she and those like her, then you have to say, at what point, Doug, and is there a point to where the United States says that is not in America's interest? We are not going to support that and actually enable that? Or do we just maintain the status quo and let them do whatever they want?
We have members from Our Country, Our Choice who are down in North Carolina and Tennessee, and they're very frustrated. And I have several friends that have gone down there to help them. Some of them are West Point graduates who are now out of the Army that are helping to do things. And several people have called me and said, we're so frustrated down here. I guess the only solution to the problems that we have in North Carolina and Tennessee is to rename the two states Ukraine and Israel. If we rename those two states, Ukraine and Israel, then billions of dollars would be released overnight and everything down here would change. I think that sums it up.
Yeah, and that's part of the real problem here is that because of this attitude that we've seen from the top of this show all the way on down, where we're talking about, we don't want to be isolationists. We want to take care of our needs, and we want all this military equipment. We want all this military funding. It's always about going over there at the expense, a la your golden spike issue, of what's going on in the United States. And is there any way to turn that back, to change it, other than some kind of catastrophic event where somebody we support is defeated or us being defeated militarily?
If President Trump is ultimately elected, I know him, and his heart is in the right place on all these things. His intentions are to make peace. His intentions are to reach an amicable outcome. That doesn't mean it can be done, and it doesn't mean that the people that surround him will help that to happen. But I know that that's his intention. So I think under those circumstances, the best shot we have at this point is President Trump. But your larger question is, what's it going to take? And that's one of the questions that comes up in many discussions. And you have a lot of people that are just absolutely convinced that we can print money for another 10 or 20 years. Nothing will change. I don't think that's true, but that's more conventional wisdom than I think many people realize. And the second part of it is that we are invincible and vulnerable. No one can challenge us. And, we are, after all, primarily a maritime and aerospace power, and you're up against continental powers. And just as we've seen in Ukraine, up against a continental power is a dead end. You're going to lose. This is something, again, that Eisenhower understood very well in the 1950s. It's why, he was supportive of neutrality for Austria, because he said, that's wonderful. We can't possibly defend all these countries. We don't have the resources. We should try to urge neutrality for other states in Eastern Europe. Well, that went away pretty quickly. He also thought that NATO, if it was still around in 10 years, that we had failed, because he was confident that some new modus vivendi could be reached with Moscow. Well, that may or may not have been true. Today, it's absolutely possible, and there's no reason why our relationships with Russia, China, Iran, and all these other countries need to be permanently militarized. But that's the path we're on right now.
So, and let me ask you, sticking in the Middle East for the moment, that's if Trump wins, but let's look at the other half of that, because it's a coin flip. It's a razor's edge right now. And it could just as easily be a continuation of the Biden administration with Kamala Harris now on the top of the ticket going forward. And right now, I think we're in a pause situation to where both that leaked intelligence and Biden himself has said he knows that Israel is ready to do something against Iran, and he knows when it's going to happen. Now, my guess is that you probably had Russia and China putting pressure on Israel not to do anything during the BRICS meeting. And I'm certain that you have the administration saying don't do anything before November the 5th. So those clocks are both ticking. They're getting close to coming down. But after that, the BRICS is over, and after the election, then I think the chance for action goes way up. What do you think would happen in the event that Israel does strike a lethal blow into Iran? What could that unleash?
Well, first of all, I do think that the incentive is there for Mr. Netanyahu to attack Iran before the election, because that starts a war that the successor government is going to be stuck with having to fight or sort through. In other words, waiting until after the election is a risk from their standpoint that President Trump doesn't win and that they get another round of Kamala Harris, who isn't going to support them to the extent that they want it. So, the incentive is let's not take any chances, because we know if President Trump wins, at least in their minds, he'll do whatever we want. So I think you have a very high chance of seeing it happen before 5 November. Whenever it happens, I think we can bet on certain things. I don't think the initial attack, unless the Iranians decide to include nuclear weapons, and I certainly hope they don't, because that would have ominous consequences for them and us and everybody. That would really release the genie from the bottle. But assuming that they hit Iran with everything they can otherwise, I think the Iranians will respond with devastating attacks. And 2 more batteries of THAAD and 2 more radars like the THAAD radar, brilliant radar as it is, it's not going to change much. And we just, any air and missile defense system, I don't care who it is or how good it is, can be overwhelmed with enough missiles, projectiles, and so forth. So I think then you have a standoff, and we have to ask ourselves, Israel is in ruins, being terrible damage done to Iran. Will we and the Russians come to some sort of arrangement before this thing goes any further? At the moment, I don't see that happening, in which case I think Iran will unleash everything it has, and they will have the full support of the Russians, to include Russian military advice, equipment, and support. And I think the Europeans will be frightened to death of the prospect of that spreading to them. And I think Europeans may well stand up and take the bull by the horns and say, enough in Ukraine. We don't want to be dragged into this. We'll see. The Chinese, of course, have already made it very clear that they will back Iran and Russia to the hilt. They're very worried about their access to the Persian Gulf and what comes out of it. There are other things, too, that have to be factored in, but I don't see anything good happening at that point. And again, now, if President Trump is elected, this is already ongoing. He gets in there, he reviews the situation, he may decide, this is enough. It can't go any further. We can't have it anymore. I don't know. I know his heart's in the right place, as I've said before. This is a man, at least from the standpoint of what's good for the United States, knows that war is not a good thing for us. Thank God he understands that.
And you see from that headline that Gary showed right now, it's just 3 hours ago that Gilad is saying that, the world is about to see the power of the Israeli Air Force, and they'll see all their training, et cetera, very boisterous things. I can't imagine that being an empty threat. So you may well be right that something happens even before the November election. And gracious, I mean, there's so many different variants of what could happen after that. I can't think of a single one that would be good. So I guess we're going to have to watch that and just keep on monitoring this for everybody.
Well, we haven't
Anything.
we haven't talked at all, and I don't think this is the time or the place to do it. Others, I hope, will pick up this theme. What happens to the finance markets? What happens to our economic position, which is not strong? This is the other myth. Somebody said, well, we're the healthiest horse in the glue factory. Wow.
Well,
that's your definition of
that's
strength.
an interesting way to put it.
That's pretty terrible, isn't it?
So, yeah, it is. And I'm just thinking out loud, Doug, as you're saying that, I'm just thinking, okay, if the BRICS summit, I think, is about halfway done, so it's got another, I think, day and a half or something like that. So it's done. And if the BRICS unit can stay outside of the conflict, and then we get sucked into something here with Israel and Iran, and then a conflagration in the Middle East, then we're going to burn ourselves down while they're going to be sitting out of it. And economically, that can only increase their strength and their position.
Well, I think you can argue right now that the Chinese have benefited enormously from staying out of conflicts. And so their preeminent goal is avoid war with anybody. And they've done it. Makes good sense. And, that was Eisenhower's real message. He did what he had to at the end of the Cold War because we were dealing with a Soviet threat, which was real, and he knew that. Mm-hmm. But his emphasis was always on avoiding conflict and finding ways around it. I think we need to get back to that and get back to that quickly.
Quickly, we do. Yeah. Well, we'll leave it there for right now, Doug. Thank you ever so much. Anything new going on with Our Country, Our Choice that we need to know about?
Well, we're really at Our Country, Our Choice. We're trying to exploit as much as possible this new platform, Republic, this new social media network. It's picking up steam. A lot of people are discovering the potential. So I hope more and more and more people will pay attention to that platform. We are Our Country, Our Choice because it gives us the opportunity to organize and communicate across the country. And once again, once you're on it, you will not be censored. You will not be canceled. It's out of the question. And as I've said to so many times, people shudder when I say this, but Nancy Pelosi can come on there and she can build a profile and she can use it. This is a free speech platform. We mean free speech, not selected speech, and we're not censoring anything. We don't want to censor anything. As long as it's not pornographic and the person is not advocating the overthrow of our government, they have the right to get on there and say whatever they want.
Well, that's certainly good. And yeah, we'll start amplifying that on this channel too, because that's right down the line with what we believe and agree with as well. Thank you very much for coming on today, Doug. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.